Turn on a lighter right now. One flick, one tiny spark. You've done it 1,000 times without thinking. But that lighter in your hand contains the single most important discovery in the history of our species. And almost everything you've been told about how it happened is wrong, not slightly wrong. Fundamentally, completely wrong. The version you learned, a bolt of lightning, a primitive human's eyes going wide, an accidental discovery that spread slowly from one lucky tribe, that story has been quietly dismantled by decades of archaeological evidence. The real story is stranger, more deliberate, and more human than anything a textbook ever gave you. And understanding what actually happened the first time a human hand made fire from nothing will permanently change how you think about what your mind is capable of. Let's start with what fire actually meant. Not warmth, not light, not cooked food. Those came later. The first thing fire gave your ancestors was time. Before controlled fire, every human on Earth operated on a single non-negotiable biological schedule. Sunset meant darkness. Darkness meant vulnerability. Every predator with night vision, lions, leopards, hyenas, owned the hours after dark completely. Your ancestors could not fight that. They could not outrun it. Their only option was to hide from it. A single controlled fire at the entrance to a shelter changed that calculation permanently. Predators with sensitive eyes and noses do not approach open flame. One fire bought back the night, and what your ancestors did with those reclaimed hours changed the structure of human society in ways we are still living inside today. But here is the first thing the textbooks got wrong. Humans did not discover fire, something that came before humans did. At Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, researchers found evidence of controlled fire dating back 1 million years. The earliest anatomically modern humans don't appear in the fossil record until 300,000 years ago. That gap is not a rounding error. That is 700,000 years of fire use by a species we would not recognize as fully human. Homo erectus, shorter, with a smaller brain, a flatter face, and no language as we understand it, was cooking food, managing flames, and selecting fuel sources while your direct ancestors were still 700 millennia away from existing. That is not what the word discovery implies. That is something far older and far stranger. Now here is where the real story begins. Because the question everyone asked for a century was the wrong one. Scientists spent decades asking when fire was first controlled. They kept finding earlier and earlier evidence and moving the date back. What nobody asked, what actually matters, is how. How does a brain that has never seen controlled fire before, that has no word for it, no cultural memory of it, no framework for understanding it as a tool, figure out not just how to keep it alive, but how to produce it from nothing? The answer took archaeologists by surprise, and it came not from the fire itself, but from what was found beside it. At multiple early fire sites across Africa and Europe, researchers found something unexpected embedded in the same archaeological layers as the oldest hearths: manganese dioxide, a dark powdery mineral that occurs naturally in certain rock deposits. On its own, that means nothing. But manganese dioxide has one extraordinary property. It dramatically lowers the temperature at which organic material ignites. In plain terms, it makes fire easier to start. Someone, at least 50,000 years ago, and likely far earlier, understood that specific rocks, when combined with specific plant material and friction, produced fire more reliably than other combinations. They were not discovering fire by accident. They were engineering the conditions that made fire inevitable. Let that sink in. Stone Age humans were doing materials science. They were selecting mineral compounds for their chemical properties, without laboratories, without written records, without any scientific framework we would recognize. They were running experiments, observing outcomes, and transmitting the results across generations as practical knowledge. The same way your grandparents taught you to cook without ever mentioning the Maillard reaction, a prehistoric parent was handing their child a specific rock and showing them exactly where to find more. But the sophistication goes further. At Poggetti Vecchi in Italy, researchers excavating a site dating back 171,000 years found dozens of wooden tools at an advanced stage of preparation. The wood used was boxwood, one of the densest, hardest woods in Europe. Getting raw boxwood to a workable state requires first heating it to weaken the fibers. Your ancestors were not using fire reactively, warming themselves beside flames they happened to find. They were using fire as a manufacturing tool, controlled heat, applied deliberately, to transform raw materials into finished products. That is not primitive behavior. That is industrial process logic. operating 171,000 years before the concept of industry existed. Now here's the part that most documentaries skip entirely. What did fire actually do to the human body? Not to survival odds, to the physical structure of the brain and face. Cooking food does something that raw food cannot. It pre-digests it. The body extracts significantly more calories from cooked food than raw food using the same digestive effort. Richard Wrangham at Harvard has spent decades building the case that cooking didn't just feed early humans better, it fundamentally restructured them. A diet of cooked food requires less gut to process. As gut size shrank over generations, the calories previously spent running that enormous digestive system were redirected to the brain. The human brain is the most metabolically expensive organ in any known species. It consumes 20% of the body's total energy while accounting for only 2% of body weight. That brain only became possible when fire freed up the calories to build and run it. In a very literal biological sense, fire did not just change what your ancestors could do. Fire built the organ you are using right now to understand this sentence. And then there was what happened after dark. Around the fire, something emerged that had no precedent in the natural world. Extended social time. Before fire, darkness ended the day completely. After fire, it didn't. Anthropologist Wiessner documented this directly, studying modern groups still living close to ancient patterns. Around nighttime fires, the conversation shifted completely. Problems got solved, plans got made, stories got told. The same firelight that kept the leopards away created the first space in human history where people could think together without immediate survival pressure. The campfire was not just a heat source. It was the first classroom, the first council chamber, the first theater. Every institution your civilization runs on, law, education, religion, governance, has its conceptual roots in the things humans first figured out how to talk about, once fire gave them the night. Go back to that lighter. One flick, one tiny spark. What your hand just did in a fraction of a second represents the compressed endpoint of 1,000,000 years of accumulated knowledge. The Homo erectus, who first learned which rock lowered ignition temperature. The hands at Poggetti Vecchi that heated boxwood into tools before anyone had a word for manufacturing. The brains that grew larger on cooked calories over hundreds of thousands of generations. The stories told by firelight that became the first threads of human culture. None of them knew what they were building. None of them could have imagined you standing here 1,000,000 years later, flicking a small metal wheel without thinking. But every single one of them made a decision to observe, to experiment, to remember, and to pass it on. That made you possible. You didn't just inherit fire. You are the product of it. The next time you flick that lighter without thinking, you're performing the final step in the longest chain of human knowledge that has ever existed. Try, just once, to feel the weight of that.